So today we're starting at the Waterloo Battlefield Visitor Centre. Quite a new building, just down here, next to the older original building that has a panoramic view. And we went to visit these yesterday, but today we're going to go for a good long walk across the battlefield, just to stretch our legs and have a break from museums. The monument here with the lion on top, which is in scaffold today, scaffold at the moment, was erected in the 1820s to commemorate the role of the Prince of Orange during the battle. Wellington hated this mound, reportedly saying it destroyed his battlefield. The road that we're along, which runs from the monument down to the farmhouse of Hougoumont that we will get to, goes down this road, which was a sunken lane during the battle on the ridge, and this was used to take ammunition and supplies and the wounded backwards and forwards across the battlefield. And it also acted as a good defensive position because there were these high banks either side of the sunken road. These are the banks that were destroyed when they built the artificial hill, but these acted as a defensive position for the infantry, and they also broke up cavalry attacks coming towards the British. Although this is a different part of our walk, this is near Papillote farmhouse, this sunken lane that we're walking along I think is a bit more like the lane would have been at the top of the ridge. What this ridge also provided was, with French cannon across the field over here firing up towards the British, they were actually made to lay down on the reverse slope here, right on the other side, so that the cannonballs would fly over the top of them. Now, we've been so lucky with the weather. It's actually glorious today. Such a good day for a walk, is it not? But then late in the afternoon of the battle, French Marshal Ney sent wave after wave, maybe 8 or 9 charges of heavy cavalry up the hill to attack the British infantry. They were on the reverse slope here, and they formed squares, this sort of array, hedgehog type array of bayonets around in a square, and they held up against these wave after wave of what must have been terrifying cavalry attacks on huge chargers. But the horses would not jump into the hedge of bayonets along here. What you can see, what you might be able to see just over here, is the garden area of Hougoumont farmhouse, which we're going to visit next. This was on the right hand end of Wellington's line facing the French, and this was defended by a strong contingent led by Coldstream Guards throughout the battle, and acted as an anchor point for the defensive line of Wellington's army. And now we get to the end of that supply road, and we find ourselves about to enter Hougoumont Farm. Now the buildings are somewhere. We're entering the walled garden area of the main part of Hougoumont Farm. Several times during the battle the French managed to break through. This memorial represents the fact that the British troops managed to close the gates again after the French had got in, and then that left the French inside to their fate. And this small chapel within the farm complex is one of the last remaining parts of the original buildings in here, many of which were burnt down during the battle. The walls around the gardens of Hougoumont Farm had loopholes knocked through them so that the defending British troops could fire out towards the French attacking. Now the area around the farm in 1815 was wooded. I mean, this is now open fields, but so the French had to come through the woods to attack these walls. But there was this open space in front of the walls which acted as a killing zone, frankly, and that was what allowed the defence to be successful all day despite wave after wave of attack. So we're now walking across the actual battlefield of Waterloo, and so I'm now looking back towards the British Ridge with the monument to the right, Hougoumont Farm over here to the left. And so the French attacks, the cavalry attacks against the squares would have been up here, and you can now see the ridge. I think, you know, now that we're down at the bottom of the hollow, I mean, calling it a valley is a bit of exaggeration, but this sort of lower ground here, and you have to rise up to get to the British. And Marshal Ney sent in the cavalry after the some of the troops which were on this forward slope were retired back behind the slope, and he thought that was probably a general retreat. But actually, rather than a full retreat, what he was seeing was troops retiring back behind the ridge and then lying down to protect themselves from the artillery fire coming over. He then sent in cavalry, but there was no infantry support, no artillery support with it, so the squares that were formed by the well-trained Allied troops were able to fend off the cavalry all afternoon. So now we're walking up the rise on the other side of the valley towards the French lines, and this is where the French attacks would have been coming from. I've wanted to do a walk across these battlefields since I first came to Waterloo in 1989, when I was taking a break over the weekend between a 2-week IBM training course I had been enrolled on, and I just didn't bother going home at the Prussians had been defeated 2 days before Waterloo at Ligny, but they had then retired to the small town of Wavre over here, and then during the day of June the 18th, the Battle of Waterloo, they then marched towards the sound of the guns, and on several fronts, some along the ridge, General Zieten, and others up through Plain-Saint-Noir, a village just across here, just off this main road. Then they came at the flank of the French, and causing Napoleon to redirect his troops away from the British and towards to try and fend off unsuccessfully the Prussians. Ahead of us now is a white building, as you can just about see, which is on the site of the former inn called the Belle Alliance, which Napoleon used as his headquarters during the battle. Blücher, who was the general commanding the Prussian army, actually wanted to call the battle La Belle Alliance, so the beautiful alliance, which I think would have been an excellent name given it was the combined forces of the Prussians, the British, the Belgians, the Dutch, Hanoverians, Nassauans and so on that managed to defeat Napoleon. But Wellington wanted to use the name of the village behind the lines, Waterloo, because he thought it sounded more British. So we've now walked across the battlefield and we're at the site that would have been Napoleon's headquarters, La Belle Alliance Inn. And looking across to that white farmhouse that you might be able to see in the distance, that's the position of the Papillote farm, which marks the left-hand side of the defensive line for Wellington, and up this main road in the middle as we get towards level with the monument is La Haie Sainte, which was the key farmhouse that was in the centre of his line, which actually fell to the French when they ran out of ammunition in the early evening. And at that point, had it not been for the Prussians arriving from over here, then the battle may well have been lost. So somewhere around here would have been part of Napoleon's Grand Battery of artillery firing towards the British. The ridge, the defensive ridge, stretches all along the top there. It's about 2 kilometres, maybe as much as 3 kilometres along from the far end at Hougoumont through to beyond Papillote. And D'Erlon, who had been marching backwards and forwards between Quatre Bras and Ligny the 2 days before, he led the first infantry attack early on in the battle, up against the defensive positions over the rise here. They were stopped by volley fire, but then cut up when the heavy cavalry, the British cavalry, charged in amongst them. The Royal Scots Greys famously leading the charge. But yes, the British cavalry had a bit of a tendency to get overexcited, and having broken up the French infantry attack, they then charged up this slope towards the cannon here, but they didn't have any equipment with them to actually disable the cannons, so it was somewhat pointless. But then they were then countercharged famously by Polish lancers, and so looking around from the right side of the French position opposite the left of Wellington, coming up that main road to the Belle Alliance. We then come to this village here. This is Plancenoit, and this was where the Prussians fought the French in the late afternoon, taking over the village, losing the village, going back and forth. And this building just down below us is where Papillote farmhouse was, and this was at the extreme left end of Wellington's line. And if you just go straight through, straight above Sam's head in front of me, then in that direction is Wavre, which Sam has resorted to having conversations with horses because she's finding my Waterloo battlefield stuff too boring. So we've now gone past Papillote Farm and we're back onto the British Ridge, or the Allied Ridge. And again, if you look at the fields here, you can see just how undulating it is. And so it was across these fields that the British cavalry, the heavy brigade, charged after the first mass infantry attack by the French columns under D'Erlon in the early part of the afternoon. Another memorial up on the ridge. This one for a French infantry battalion, the 21st Infantry of the Line Regiment, which attacked an Anglo-Scottish brigade, which would have been. I've just taken a slight detour just before the end of our walk to pay a brief visit to La Haissant farmhouse wall. So it sort of completes a personal pilgrimage from my point of view to visit all points of the battle. And so that brings us to the end of a very pleasant 8.5 kilometre walk around the battlefield, and so ticks off an item from the bucket list, something I've wanted to do for nearly 40 years. I'm glad I've done this now, having researched the battle and knowing a reasonable amount about it. Gives me the opportunity to appreciate the walk even more.